As I sit here recording this, production has begun on the new Superman movie, written and directed by James Gunn, starring David Corenswet as Superman. And at this exact same moment, there are people on Twitter still demanding that DC and Warner Brothers bring back Henry Cavill and Zack Snyder and restore the Snyderverse. We are less than a month from the premiere of the 5th and final season of Star Trek Discovery, and production is ongoing for the 3rd season of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, as well as the Section 31 movie starring Michelle Yeoh, with numerous other Trek projects in various stages of production or development. Prodigy, Lower Decks, the upcoming Starfleet Academy series. And there are people on Twitter still demanding that Paramount greenlight Star Trek Legacy, which they imagine as a continuation of the nostalgia-heavy 3rd season of Star Trek Picard, to be showrun by Terry Matalas, whose creative vision for Star Trek seems to be, let's play with the toys. Still, other Star Trek fans continue to publicly wish and occasionally beg for Picard-like continuations of other previous Trek series, like Deep Space Nine or Voyager or Enterprise. After a handful of commercially underperforming releases in a row, some fans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe are online demanding that the studio bring back Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans to reprise their celebrated but emphatically retired versions of Iron Man and Captain America. A few years ago, following the success of Spider-Man No Way Home, which featured Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield reprising their versions of Spider-Man alongside Tom Holland's MCU version, there were calls from some fans for new solo films centered on Maguire or Garfield's Spidey. There are other examples of this sort of thing I could bring up, but I think you get the point. When dedicated fans of series, franchises, fictional universes, Star Trek, Star Wars, DC Comics, Marvel, fill in the blank, express their opinions of what the next project should be, or what creative direction their favorite franchise should take, they ask for more of what they had before. They turn to the past, and that is one reason why art is one of the very, very, very few domains of life where democracy is a bad idea. There's an idea that has become conventional wisdom among certain kinds of fans that creators hired to produce new work in an established series ought to be fans of that series. And it's usually unspoken, but when people say that, they mean fans like me. Whenever they don't like a movie or a show or what have you in their favorite series, these sorts of fans will say things like, well, it's obvious the writer or director didn't understand what it's supposed to be all about. Or they'll say, this is why they should hire fans to write the show or the movie or whatever it is. This idea is, to put it as kindly as I can, fucking horseshit. There are many reasons why hiring fans to write the show, I'm just going to call it the show. I know it's not always a show, sometimes it's a movie or a book or a comic or whatever, but it's just easier this way. There are many reasons why hiring fans to write the show is a terrible idea. Most fans aren't writers. Most fans don't understand the difference between having what they think is a good idea for a story and actually producing that story. But for me, the most obvious reason is the one I just described. Most fans are only interested in or capable of conceiving of the show in terms of what they've already seen. Which is fine, by the way. I'm not saying such fans are doing anything wrong or are of lesser character. Necessarily, the lingering Snyderverse stans seem like assholes and are some of the saddest little crybabies on Twitter, and that is saying something. It's only natural to want more of something you like. Pretty much everything other than art works that way. If you have a favorite meal at a favorite restaurant, when you order that meal, you probably want it to taste like you expect it to taste based on the other times you've eaten it. You're not sitting there thinking, I hope they surprise me this time. But with art, and storytelling is an art, with art, it's different. Good art, memorable art, art that is worth the time it takes to experience it, does need to surprise us or challenge us or make us uncomfortable or defy our expectations. Not all the time, but it at least needs to be capable of it. As a rule, the best storytellers are less interested in revisiting the old and more interested in exploring the new. They think in terms of potential. And even when they do choose to revisit the past, they do so to reinterpret or recontextualize or reimagine in the hope of finding something new, not just showing us what we've seen before. That's why people have grown tired of those live-action remakes of classic Disney animated films. That's why genuinely good remakes and prequels and sequels are relatively rare. It's extremely difficult to do something fresh when you start with something that is established, familiar, and loaded with expectations. And the stories who have succeeded at that task are almost always those who show up to work with a unique take, a singular vision of their own. And that's another thing you sacrifice when you argue that writers should be fans, or should listen to fans, or should serve fans. The singular vision. There's a popular phrase among creative types: art is a dictatorship. Now, that doesn't mean an artist should be an authoritarian bully. Movie and television history is unfortunately filled with examples of people, almost always men, who took that phrase literally and treated those they worked with like minions whose job it was to do what they, the auteur, wanted without question or criticism. And that's not what I mean when I say that art should be a dictatorship, and these days I don't think it's what most people mean when they say that. Art should be collaborative, especially in forms like film and television, where many different artists are necessary to create it. Producers, writers, directors, storytellers should be open to input from others, receptive to constructive criticism, respectful of what their collaborators bring to the table. But there's a difference between art that is created through collaboration and art that is produced by committee. Just as there's a difference between art that respects and considers its audience and art that panders to its audience. Good art isn't the result of an opinion poll. Good art is a reflection of the tastes and sensibilities and perspectives and thoughts and feelings of the artists who made it. That's one of the main reasons why AI-generated art is so unimpressive when judged by the same standards by which we judge art created by actual, artists. AI art doesn't come from anyone's imagination. All an AI can give you is an amalgamation of its training data that fits the prompt you feed it. I'm not saying it isn't useful for certain applications, even at this stage of its development, but there are things, very important things, that we human beings can do that AI just isn't capable of. A striking example of what I'm talking about is that AI-generated imitation of George Carlin that was in the news a couple of months ago. In some ways, it was very impressive, but exclusively on a technical, mechanical level. It was a recognizable, coherent facsimile of a Carlin stand-up routine, but it was hollow and ultimately pointless because nothing in it came from the mind of George Carlin. Or from anyone else's mind, for that matter. There was no thought, just the appearance of thought. There was no point of view, just the emulation of one. And I know this feels like I've strayed from my original point, but I don't think I have. Or at least I haven't wandered that far. Because when fans express their dissatisfaction with the current state of their favorite show and say things like, they should let the fans write it, and demand that artists make creative choices with them, the fans, in mind, instead of trying to tell their stories as they see fit to, when fans do that, they're basically asking storytellers to do what an AI does. They're not interested in seeing what a creative mind or a team of creative minds does with Star Trek or Superman or whatever. They're interested in having their expectations met precisely, and that's it. And those expectations are based on what they've already seen. They want a result based on their prompt derived from the training data. Not all fans are like this. I would hope that goes without saying, but it probably doesn't, so I'm saying it. I make a somewhat decent living making videos where I share my thoughts and opinions about Star Trek and superhero comics and this kind of stuff. And I know not all of you think I'm full of shit, but the fans who do insist that fans should be writers or writers should be fans or at least should consult fans or write with the goal of serving fans tend to be the loudest and would be the most likely to have their voices heard if a creator decided to solicit input from the audience. Hence, those are the fans I'm focusing on. Also, I'm not suggesting that writers should never be fans. Lots of great artists have contributed to long-running franchises that they came to after being fans of it. The trick is being able to know the difference between being a writer and a fan. When you're a writer, or a director, or an actor, or any other category of contributor to the thing, your job is to serve the story, to serve the work, not to serve the fans. Or at least not to serve the fans directly. If you make a good show, that's the best kind of fan service there is. What I am suggesting is that writers don't need to be fans. Richard Donner was not a Superman nerd when he was hired to direct Superman. Nicholas Meyer was not a Trekkie when he was hired to direct Star Trek II. Having a long-standing familiarity with the material can be a big help, but the truth is you can study up on the important stuff in relatively little time, no matter how many years the series in question has existed. Nicholas Meyer couldn't quote Star Trek the original series, chapter and verse. I bet he still can't. And he doesn't need to, because he knows how to tell a story, and he understands his characters. Richard Donner probably couldn't have told you where the tomb of Norcon is located in the bottle city of Kandor, or named all the different colors of kryptonite and what their effects are, and who gives a shit anyway? Stuff like that is not important. It's trivia, and we call it that because it's fucking trivial. Donner had a concept of who Superman is and how best to tell a story on film about him. That's what matters. Because I talk about Star Trek a lot, and because I also talk about writing and storytelling a lot, like now, for instance, I occasionally get asked by some of you what I would like to see in a new Star Trek series. Sometimes the question is more narrowly focused, and I'll get asked something like, what planets would you want to revisit? Or what characters would you like to see again? Or what episodes would you like to see a sequel to? That sort of thing. And those questions are easy to answer because the answer is always the same. None. I don't want a new show to show me stuff I've seen before. I want a new series to show me new stuff. Even within an established framework like Star Trek, it's always possible to do new things. The Next Generation did it. Deep Space Nine did it. Discovery and Strange New Worlds haven't always done it, but at their best they have. Sometimes the question comes in a slightly different, but also narrowly focused form, something like, if Paramount came to you and offered to hire you to create a new season of any Star Trek series from TOS through Enterprise, which series would you want to create a new season of? And that one's easy too. I don't want that job. And I don't want anyone else to have that job either. I don't want more seasons of an old Star Trek show. Deep Space Nine is my favorite Star Trek show and one of my favorite shows, period. But it's over. It was on for 7 years. They made 176 episodes of it, and it's over. And it's been over for 25 years. I've moved on. If anyone else in the fan base hasn't moved on, that's their fucking problem. When the question is phrased more generally, what do you want to see in a new Star Trek series? It's easy to answer, but difficult to articulate, if that makes sense. I don't know what I want to see because I haven't seen it yet. A while ago, Ira Steven Behr, showrunner of Deep Space Nine, was being interviewed, and he described it better than I could. He said, a writer's job isn't to ask the fans what they want and then give it to them. A writer's job is to give the fans something they didn't know they wanted until they got it. And that's what I want. Not just from Star Trek, but from Star Wars, the DCU, the MCU, and every other movie or TV show I watch, or book or comic book I read, or any story I encounter in my life. I want stories by storytellers who don't care what I want, who give me what I never knew I wanted. And I think what I want would be pretty good. In my more self-flattering moments, I imagine what kind of a Star Trek show I would want to create, and it looks pretty good to me. Of course it does. It only exists in my mind, and what am I going to do? Imagine that a show I created would suck? I'm going to imagine it as a great show, because I'm going to imagine it as a show created according to my taste, and I think my taste is amazing, and it's not just my opinion either. Ask your mother. But that doesn't mean that I, as a fan or as a dipshit who makes YouTube videos where I talk about Star Trek and occasionally airdrop in vulgar your mom jokes, should be consulted by the actual creators of Star Trek shows. People who get to make shows should be allowed to make the shows they want to make, not the shows they think I or anyone else in the audience would want them to make. I'll tell you this. If I ever did get hired to write for Star Trek, or Superman, or Batman, or any other thing with a big pre-existing fan base, I'm doing what I want to do, as much as I can get away with doing it. Maybe my boss, a producer, or studio executive, or editor, or publisher, or whoever, will swoop in and tell me that I can't do this, or I have to do that, and I'll have to make it work if I want to keep the job, but I'll be goddamned if I ever give a first thought, let alone a second thought, to what any know-it-all nerds in the audience think. Except, of course, your mother, who is a know-it-all nerd, but also possesses a strong sense of story, has a surefire instinct regarding when to lean into convention and when to depart from it, and always gives me excellent writing advice. As far as I can tell, anyway. Sometimes it is difficult to make out what she's saying with her mouth full!